Hi, Dr. P here to talk at some length about 10 need-to-knows about the business side of tabletop game licensing. And a lot of this applies to video game licensing as well. Self-publishing is a separate topic. I'm just going to talk about licensing. Now, as it happens, it's a lot easier to self-publish a video game than to get one licensed, because no manufacturing is required for a video game, and the distribution channels are well established in Steam and the Play stores like Google Play. But in tabletop, manufacturing and distribution is much more of a problem, so lots of people would prefer to license their games, although it's quite difficult. And here's a list of what I'm going to talk about. First of all, how the system works, and I'm going to have to go on about this at some length. A designer, sometimes through an agent, sends queries, not full submissions, just a query letter, to a publisher. Now you need to look at the publisher's website and see what they want and how they want it. Because if you don't conform to how they want things to be submitted, they may simply ignore you. Because they get so many submissions, they're looking for ways to ignore people. And one is that people can't follow instructions. Now I said sometimes through an agent. Most of the time people don't use agents, but if you want to approach Hasbro or Ravensburger, some of the really big publishers, they'll only accept things that go through agents unless you happen to be one of the people that they've decided they'll talk to directly. So the publisher may request further information, or they may require you to sign a release. If they request further information, they may ask for the electronic files of the game. If you don't have electronic files, you've got a problem. Or they may ask for a physical copy, although that's a lot less common. Because, again, they get so many submissions, they can just look at the electronic files and often tell whether the game is going to be suitable, or at least they think they can. Now, what's a release? A release says that the publisher can publish a game very much like yours with no obligation to you. And you might say, what? Well, this is a CYA, cover your ass thing, to protect the company from litigious noobs. Because what happens is without the release, you may get some not very with it publisher, or rather designer, who thinks they have a great game, and in fact it's just like a lot of other games. And when the publisher then later publishes a game that they think is like theirs, they sue them. Well, if they've signed a release like this, they have no legal standing to sue. So don't get offended when the publisher asks you to sign a release of this kind, because if you don't, they're not going to talk to you, period. At any point in this process, of course, they may, practically speaking, say, get lost. They may tell you they're not interested. That may be because of their schedule, not because of your game. It can be for lots of reasons. If they have a farming game in print, they may not consider another farming game. It doesn't matter how good it might be, they're just not going to consider one of the same topic or subject. This happened to me. The topic was water pirates. Years later, the game is under contract with another publisher. Or they may say they want to publish, which is still a long way from actually getting published. When you contract with a publisher, you're selling them the right to publish, but they're not obligated to do so. And that's usually an exclusive right, at least within a certain territory. Like you could sell the right to publish in North America and sell to someone else the right to publish in Europe. But typically nowadays, the print runs of individual games are small enough that most publishers want worldwide rights. They may have a standard contract, or they may not use a contract at all. That latter is amateurish, but it can work. It can be a long time from contract signing to publication. A year is probably the minimum. Typical is longer than that. And sometimes it can be very long. Mayfair had one game that I was told they'd had for 8 years before they published it. Well, I had a game under contract at Mayfair for more than 8 years before it was returned to me unpublished. Now, I was paid a substantial advance, and most publishers don't do that. Otherwise, I wouldn't have left the game there that long. What happened was the people who accepted the game left the company to form Catan Incorporated. Now the next topic is, how do I get in? How do I become part of all this? Well, again, publishers get hundreds of queries each year. How do you stand out from the crowd? You can do that by establishing a personal relationship, usually at conventions, unless you happen to live near the publisher. Volunteer to man their booth at a convention. You can also write articles about their games. With the 4 Ps, do whatever you can to stand out. I'll talk about the 4 Ps in a minute. Now, I've been talking about freelancing. There are a few full-time game designers employed in tabletop games. Hasbro has some, Fantasy Flight Games, maybe a few others. I'm pretty sure they're not well paid compared with other kinds of jobs in general. Now, the full-timers are likely to make more than most freelancers, but it's been notable that some of the full-timers have recently left their full-time for freelance, so who knows? You own copyright on a game as soon as you create it, but copyright doesn't protect game ideas. Somebody can use the same ideas. Take Risk, for example. Somebody can make a game, give it a different title, rewrite the Risk rules, draw a new map that's exactly the same. The game works exactly the same. That is legal. That is legal. In fact, you can find like a dozen versions of Risk online that people play, but it's not called Risk usually. Now, patents can protect a particular expression of an idea, but hardly any games are patented, because patent is really expensive both upfront and as time passes, and it's hard to defend. About 2/3 of patents that go to court are invalidated or overthrown. Trademarks is somewhat more practical. The common law trademark costs nothing and it's easy, but it doesn't apply until the game's published. The registered trademark, which is the R in a circle, costs several $100s and is more reliable generally, especially if you have to sue somebody. But the bottom line here is nothing protects game ideas, practically speaking, and that's just the way it is. I mentioned the 4 Ps: polite, prompt or punctual, professional, persistent. It costs nothing but your attention to be polite. It really doesn't cost much to be prompt or punctual, but it may be especially hard for some millennials to understand. Most businesses rely on deadlines. If you can't be on time, they don't want to or can't afford to deal with you. Being professional involves being a good listener, not a big talker. Persistence is what it is, but don't become a pest. Just don't give up. What about licensing versus works for hire? If you do a work for hire, you get a lump sum of money and you assign all rights permanently to someone else. You don't own it anymore. You have no say ever in what is done with it. You get no royalties. This is typical in RPGs. Somebody writes an RPG book, could be 100,000 words, they get paid a lump sum, that's it. They no longer have any rights in it. Generally, it's unwise to sell all rights. I stopped writing for Dragon magazine in the early 80s because they switched to requiring purchase of all rights. Before that, they had accepted buying just first world serial rights. So they could print it in their magazine and then I owned the rights. So I can now do a reprint book or books of all my articles from Dragon because I retained the rights. If I'd sold all the rights to Britannia and Dragon Rage, I'd not have been able to get them reissued in new editions. Matt Forbeck, who makes a living at games and novels, sold all rights to something he'd done, but the lump sum was so large he was happy to do so. Don't spend money on artwork or fancy prototypes. If it looks good enough for playtesters to willingly play, it's good enough for submission. It's no longer the days of boards written on paper bags or handwriting on cards. That's both because computer-generated stuff is fairly easy to do and because playtesters will rarely play, obviously, homemade, slapped-together games. At some point, you need to negotiate an agreement with a publisher. As with any negotiation, if you fall in love with the idea, then you have no leverage. You have to be willing to walk away. In any case, the publisher has the upper hand. There are a lot more designers who want the games to be published than publishers who are not self-publishers or have internal designers. And it's their money. They're taking the risk. Whatever a contract says, that's what counts. It doesn't matter what they may tell you orally. It's what is on the paper. If you don't understand something, don't sign it. Don't let somebody tell you, well, it means such and such. Make sure you can understand what's written on the paper. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I deal with all my contracts because lawyers are rarely worth the cost, given how little you're likely to earn. But you have to decide that, not me. A contract should include many things, but two that are important are reversion of rights to you when the game is out of print, and you have to define what out of print is, like less than 100 copies sold in a calendar year or in 12 months. And it has to include revision of rights, if not reversion of rights, if not published. You have to define that by a deadline. So if this is not published, which means at least 500 copies printed and available for sale, let's say, if it's not published by a certain date, the rights revert to you. And there's a lot more things than we can cover here. I have, of course, many separate screencasts about many of these topics. Now, the final result, what's actually published, may be quite different from what you submitted. The publisher almost always provides their own art, of course. They're also likely to change the game. Sometimes they'll change it for the better, as a good editor might do, sometimes for the worse. It's not your game anymore, it's their game. Now, a few people have enough leverage that they can state in the contract that the game cannot be substantially changed. But not many people have that kind of leverage. I've been able to do that with Britannia, but if you're unpublished, you won't have that leverage. This is no different than novels say. The publisher owns the novel for the length of the license, not the author. And when I complete my Succeeding as a Game Designer courses on udemy.com, then I will be talking about these things at much greater length. And you can go to pulseforgames.com to see the latest information about my classes. Thanks for listening.